Hey internets, the time has come for another breadtube/communist tube refutation video. So one particularly bad argument, which is really more of just a bad rhetorical tactic that still somehow persists today in 2026, is of course the disingenuous tactic of just simply accusing everybody you disagree with of being a Nazi, or Newtsies as I like to sometimes say, just to drive home the silliness of the argument. And very silly it is indeed because the accusation is almost always false. And the interesting thing is that, again, we're in 2026 and most people are aware that these accusations are usually false. Even apolitical people in the Pacific Northwest here, even the normies kind of know these days that accusing someone of being a Nazi, or literally Hitler, is not really a serious argument. It's just a rhetorical political tactic that doesn't necessarily have any basis in truth, and of course the normies tend to know this as well. Everyone just kinda knows that most of the time calling someone a Newtsie is just a way to smear them. It's barely any different than just a general insult, except in addition to being an insult, it tries to justify hand-waving away what is being said. Or on the more extreme end of things, a way to justify being violent towards their target. And people are again largely aware of this. Argumentum ad Hitlerum is probably the #1 fallacy that in the last 5 years has significantly lost its bite. It's a grift that you'd like to think has run its course, and yet people still continue to engage in this disingenuous tactic. And so what I'm going to do for you all in this video is I'm going to go over a recent video from Second Thought, where he tries to answer the question why the White House won't stop posting Nazi propaganda, and we'll be going over it to answer the different question, which is the question of why it is that communists won't stop falsely accusing everyone they disagree with of being fascists. But first, I'm not going to be selling anything for this video, but I would like to point out that for my questions and answers videos I do give priority to my channel members and Subscribestar members. So if you want to help support me and my content, and potentially have one of your questions appear in one of my videos, then consider either joining the channel as a member or checking out my Subscribestar link in the description below. But anyways, let's get started. I'll be mainly just going over the relevant bits. If you believe I am taking them out of context, or if you want to check if that is the case, a link to Second Thought's full video will be in the description below. And I'll start things off with this clip.
This is Adolf Hitler's My New Order, the sequel to Mein Kampf. In it, you'll find a collection of Hitler's most famous speeches. And if you're wondering where to find it, don't bother with a local bookstore. You can start with the president's bedside table. According to a 1990 interview in Vanity Fair, that's where Ivana Trump frequently saw her then husband, now president, put this little number down after reading it, quote, from time to time. Okay, but actually there is something we need to talk about first. No one thinks that Trump just reading this book or other normal things like getting Heil Hitlered by his friends is actually incriminating. So why then is the White House swimming in Nazi propaganda?
So yeah, the start of his video and the start of his argument may, at first, on the surface, seem very bizarre indeed. Why on earth would he make a bad argument and then immediately roll it back and call it out as a bad argument, but then not actually explain anything as to why it's a bad argument? Because indeed, saying that Orange Man, or anybody at all for that matter, is literally Bad Mustache Man, based entirely on the fact that he read the sequel to Mein Kampf, is a very nonsensical argument indeed. And yet, I often see people make the argument over and over and over again, and it's been debunked over and over and over again. It's a very silly association fallacy. Reading something obviously does not mean that you believe everything that you read. I personally have read Leviathan. I have read Karl Marx on Das Kapital. I have read Rothbard's Anatomy of the State, and yes, I have indeed read Mein Kampf. Now, anybody who's read these 4 books, you probably see the immediate problem here. All 4 of them paint a very different picture on how the power structures of society works, and what, if any, exploitation exists, along with very different ideas of how society works. TLDR, it's not really possible to believe everything in all 4 of these books. At least not with severely contradicting yourself on multiple levels. Reading these books will not turn you into some kind of Newtsie ANCAP Hobbesian commie. That is very much not a thing. As opposed to using your sense of reason to determine what is and what isn't true from the books that you are reading, which absolutely is a thing. In fact, it's a very, very common thing. And Second Thought seems to understand this, and yet he makes the silly argument anyway, only to, again, immediately walk it back. Now, whether he himself is just memeing here, I do have some insight in general why people sometimes do this, which is that it's a way to kind of gain the benefit of a rhetorical argument without fully committing to it. Because while some people are plenty smart enough to see right through that kind of association fallacy, a lot of other people sadly are just not. Because a quick look around the internet, you'll find out that one of the things Second Thought said there, which is that nobody believes this, well, actually around the internet, plenty of people do believe this. A lot of people actually do fall for this association fallacy. A lot of people really will say, oh, he read Hitler, therefore that's additional evidence for why we should consider that this person is a Nazi. It is extremely common. And so what's really going on here is he's doing a Mott and Bailey disguised as said association fallacy. He makes the bad argument and then immediately retreats to the Mott, so that way he can fool the people who fall for the bad argument while maintaining an intellectual facade in the faces of people who would call the bad argument out for why it is bad. It's very, very disingenuous. It's a trick designed to fool a very specific type of person while pretending that you're not. But anyway, let's look at a few of the examples of the so-called Nazi propaganda that the White House has been reposting. We'll have our home again. Join ICE. America needs you. Join ICE now. A heritage to be proud of. A homeland worth defending. American progress. John Gast. From the Department of Homeland Security. Or Department of Labor. One homeland, one people, one heritage. Remember who you are, American. And your nation calls. Yeah, so it's kind of obvious where he's actually going here, which is an argument that really isn't much better than the one that he just pretended to not actually believe, but stated it anyway. The issue with it here is it's always based on an extreme oversimplification of what specifically fascism is. Fascism is much, much more complicated than simply having a nation state and having a national identity. And whether you agree with that concept of national identity or agree with ICE or not, the reality is that what it is doing is pretty much what every nation has been doing for a very long time. In fact, Trump's immigration policy would probably be considered pretty open if we were to go back into the mid-1900s during World War II and look at America's immigration policy back then. By comparison, things would actually be considered less radical. And yet America was fighting against the literal Nazis. And that's because there's again very distinct differences. Fascism includes total state control over society. It's the idea that the people are actually owned by the state and are servants to the state. And this includes a heavily state-controlled economy and usually a heavily militaristic and expansionist foreign policy. So it's more than just we love our country and we want to secure our borders. That is, again, just an oversimplification. It's more like our nation is superior, our state is superior, and so we must dominate and control the lesser inferior nations in order to have a stable world. And then finally, it tries to remake society top-down under one infallible, unquestionable leader. And so by seething about ICE, what they're really doing here is they're just creating a straw man where they're seething over one specific policy which has some similarity to actual National Socialists. But the thing is, you need more than just that one thing. You need the whole package. You can't just say, oh, literally Mustache Man breathed air and you're breathing air, therefore you're literally bad Mustache Man. You need more than just one thing. And at that point, it's also important to point out what this video doesn't really talk about, which is how fascism rejects the individual and has a largely collectivist framework of society. That is, of course, because Second Thought himself is a literal commie. So he doesn't actually disagree with that concept, and by admitting it, he's actually committing a case of special pleading. And I'll have more on that later, because there's another very important thing that you have to go over before moving on, which is that not only is this a straw man, and not only is it a special pleading because he's a commie, but also this is a false dichotomy. You absolutely can have some kind of cultural identity without a state. For example, you have the Orania Project. Or to put an oversimplification of Rothbard's essay on nations by consent, you can have something being such thing as an our nation and having it actually be completely within individualist philosophy. It just has to be by consent. It has to have a freedom of association contract both ways. All parties have to mutually agree to be a part of the R. And so this idea that identity itself can be inherently Nazi, well, that's just nonsense. Because identity absolutely can still work as long as it makes sure to put the individual first. That is the difference between a covenant and a commune. You absolutely could have a covenant community with private borders so long as everybody is consenting to be a part of that community and the rules of that community are agreed upon by the individual through contract. And this kind of philosophy is just completely missing from Second Thought's video. He doesn't bring it up or really question it much at all. And so the argument being made here is pretty much that borders is when Nazi, which is just not accurate. Nazi is much more complicated and includes much more things than just borders, and borders don't even necessarily have to be state borders. And with just that understanding alone, you can kind of just reject Second Thought's entire video on its face. But there's actually a lot more here, specifically some interesting things that a lot of people miss with communist propaganda. So let's continue on going over this clip next.
The DHS Twitter account has had a similar problem. Recently, they've used lyrics from a white nationalist song as promotional material, as well as a neo-Nazi slogan, and so has the DOL's Twitter. More than once. More than twice. And then once more back on the DHS account. For months now, we've seen post after post using white supremacist, far-right, and at times even outright Nazi rhetoric. The White House has called immigration an invasion, called the opposition wicked and evil, made Trump and ICE out to be irreproachable, called themselves the heirs to the Roman Empire, and implored their supporters to defend a declining, i.e. less white, nation.
Okay, so what we just listened to, in addition to just further doubling down on this combination of association fallacies with an oversimplification of what fascism is, and basically just arguing that Nutsi is win IDPOL and border defense, and pretty much again that's just his entire argument, you may have noticed something else in addition here right at the end of that little spiel, which is the absolutely massive element of projection that's happening here. Because earlier on in his video, one of the clips that Second Thoughts shares, as evidence of alleged Nutsyism, is a clip from Charlie Kirk's funeral. And if you're plugged into politics and news at all, you of course know that Charlie Kirk was assassinated for his beliefs, with the motivation for that assassination arguably being the fact that he was smeared for being a Nutsi. And while Second Thought isn't outright coming out and condoning that assassination, and condoning political violence, he doesn't outright say it, there's definitely a little bit of a wink wink nudge nudge implication going on here. Because here he is complaining about Orange Man demonizing his opponents, and yet the entire point of this video is for Second Thought to demonize his opponents. The whole implication here is, oh, you're a Nutsi, and Nutsis are the ultimate bad guys because we live in a post-World War II origin story, and Nutsis were the bad guys, and therefore any action against those we deem as Nutsis is therefore justified. That's effectively what's being implied here, not outright stated, but really how else are we supposed to interpret this? Because it's not really a big secret. In fact, it's actually one of the most well-known grifts of the far left. Step 1, give rhetoric of why you shouldn't be tolerant of Nutsis, and why violence against them is justified. Step 2, demonize your political opponents as Nutsis. And that's why him whining about Orange Man, bringing up Chuck Schumer with this silly little meme about the Democratic Party being dead and satanic and whatever. I mean, yeah, it's kinda dumb, but Second Thought is effectively doing the same thing with his entire video. And keeping that in mind, let's continue on to the next clip, which, by the way, happens right after he points out Orange Man and the little Schumer meme about the Democrats being evil. Here we go.
This is all very Nazi stuff, of course, and it shouldn't surprise us too much from a government that's had 1, 2, 3, 4, and who could forget 5, oops, there's a Nazi in our ranks moments.
Yep, that's right, he immediately goes into some additional random accusations of some people being Nutsis. Wink wink, nudge nudge. Now each of the examples he just spat out in rapid succession there could easily use their own explanation, but the TLDR of it is he's lying. That's pretty much it, he's just not telling the truth. The easiest one to refute though is probably just Elon Musk. False Nazi accusers always love to post a still image of this, or just the video of Musk doing that salute out of context, while completely ignoring the actual speech that Musk gave, which was about humanity going to space and Doge and reducing government spending, which is all pretty normal, fairly milquetoast, inoffensive liberal conceptions of free market discourse. And yet I've noticed that far-left progressives, they love to pretend like Elon's speech was about rounding up all the undesirables into death camps, which of course is not what his speech was about. But again, they don't say that, they don't actually make that argument, they just imply it by taking it out of context and then not elaborating further. They're just like, yep, there's a salute, he's a Nutsi, and that's it. Unless of course they are actually considering his speech, in which case they're wanting to make the argument that the free market is somehow Nutsi, which surprisingly is very close to what Second Thought says next. Behold this clip.
In his book Disaster Nationalism, Richard Seymour writes that the only thing the far right can actually deliver is adrenaline and revenge. Not happiness, not solutions, just anxiety and the immediate relief of, quote, a shot of confidence and a thrill of collective hate. That's because in every single far-right regime, the arc of history looks the exact same. First, they hijack the rhetoric of other political parties, particularly the left. As the opposition, the far-right promises to solve the problems of the middle and lower classes that are ignored by the establishment. Poverty, low wages, inflation, the far-right promises these things can be solved, but not with radical change. only with radical violence. And it always fails.
Yep, that's right. We have now reached the right wing is when bad thing, left wing is when good thing part of the argument. This is the point of his video where we've kind of just completely left the realm of reality. Because there is valid criticism you can throw towards ICE. There are, in fact, some good arguments and some valid criticism to be made there. He didn't really make those good arguments, but they do exist. But instead, we've now entered the true area where we're just talking partisan nonsense, and kind of taking advantage of the fact that a lot of people don't even really know what left and right really is. The basis behind the origin story of what we call left versus right is really just this concept that came kind of at the dawn between the Enlightenment and the Victorian era, where the question was whether or not you believe the monarchy should still maintain some level of private ownership of government, with the people believing that that should be the case being to the right of the monarchy, and the people not believing that being to the left. Which then, as time went on and liberalism kind of became the more dominant ideology, especially into the 1800s, the concept of left and right more evolved towards the idea of just private ownership in general being kind of a right-wing concept, and public or collective ownership being more of the left-wing concept. That's really the basics of what it means. A bit of an oversimplification, but just about everything else about left versus right can stem from that. And because of that, the closest thing to right wing today is really just free marketeering. If you believe in the free market and private ownership of the means of production, and believe in private property rights, then you are effectively a right-winger. There's a lot more to it than that, and then there's the cultural aspect, but that's a whole other can of worms because there's certain cultures that work with the free market and certain cultures that don't. And to try and imply that, like Second Thought is doing here, is completely insane, because the free market is one thing that the right has absolutely delivered on. Nearly all economic growth in the last 200 years, at least in an empirical sense, can be directly attributed to what the right is offering. Which then brings the question, okay, why this obfuscation? Well, honestly, I kind of suspect that this is just a case of him pretending to not understand things. Second Thought, being a commie, should know, or at least ought to know, or has interacted with the right enough to understand that he is massively strawmanning what the difference is between the right and the left. The big thing being ignored here is that if we're going to talk about far-right regimes, we're kind of ignoring the fact that based on how leftist progressive today view the right wing, nearly everything from the 1800s in nearly every country would be considered far right. And yet we're instead just kind of focusing on this idea that right wing is when bad thing, right wing is when Nutsi, and that's it. And especially the bit about radical violence and how that being the only way to change things. That's something that actually comes from the left. Not the general left like the DNC, most of them aren't violent. I mean more from the communists, because their regimes do pretty much exactly the same thing as actual fascist regimes did. North Korea did the same thing, China under Mao Zedong did the same thing, and Stalin did the same thing, and Lenin did the same thing. Is Second Thought going to come out and try and claim those guys as quote-unquote right-wing next? Well, probably not. Again, he's probably just projecting, which shows itself in the next clip.
When the far right gets into power, their first order of business is cutting workers' rights and union busting and making the bosses happy. And if people starve, they don't care about the breadlines. But people do. We do. When fascists promise to help workers and things don't get better, when reality doesn't match up to the campaign promises, the only thing left for the fascist right is violent escalation.
So one thing I should point out here is that a valid argument Second Thought is making is that he is at least providing some criticism of fascism as it actually existed in history. And this wouldn't even be that bad of a video if he didn't Mott and Bailey between that and trying to completely blanket the entire idea of right wing as being equivalent to fascist regimes. As I pointed out earlier, a big thing going on here is just a Mott and Bailey fallacy. When you realize he's dancing between two very different arguments, which is a historical definition of fascism based on how fascist regimes actually operated, and a more general, oh, Nazism is when borders argument, then well, that's when the obvious dishonesty starts to show its face. In this case, yes, fascist regimes largely failed to provide the economic benefits that they promised. Historically, fascist regimes anyway. This is one of the reasons why, me personally, I'm a right-wing libertarian, and am deeply suspicious and critical of any kind of right-wing authoritarian, highly statist control of the economy, mainly because it just doesn't actually make any sense. They end up committing the same errors of economic illiteracy as the commies do. Which, wait a minute, oh yeah, that's right, Second Thought is a communist. And he's whining about breadlines in mid-1900s Germany. Never mind the famine of Mao Zedong under communism, which was arguably 1,000 times worse. That's an important takeaway from Second Thought's video, and what's kind of so amazing about watching it is it just oozes projection. Just about every accusation he makes is in a confession from his own ideology. When you listen to his arguments, and keep in mind that Second Thought is a total commie and actually has a podcast with other commies. He's part of the Deprogram, which is an outright, unapologetic, tanky podcast. The absurdity of these arguments really just comes to light. Because what he's really doing here is he's criticizing fascism based on the same tenets of reality that can also be used to criticize communism. And so it's just an unintentional self-own. But going back to the Mott and Bailey element, he then doubles down on that further. Let's move on to the next clip.
Propaganda wasn't just beamed into the minds of ordinary people, turning them into ethno-nationalists. The state and the population became entangled in their mutually reinforcing desires to ignore everything getting worse around them by finding common pleasure in living out violent fantasies. Things don't improve, but at least someone is doing something. It's why so many Trump supporters today believe he's kept his promises. Groceries aren't less expensive. Electricity costs haven't been slashed in half. America's reputation is in the trash. Of course, going after every brown person in the country wasn't going to help with any of that.
So yeah, as we can see, it's just further and further entering into the world of projection. Living out violent fantasies while the economy doesn't improve. What is that? Oh, that's right. That's nearly every single communist regime ever. That's what Mao Zedong did, that's what Pol Pot did, that's what Kim Il-sung did, and that's what Lenin and Stalin did. It is very interesting how communists can't actually criticize these regimes without also incriminating the communist regimes of the past. And part of this, the problem really is that fascism isn't actually a right-wing ideology, rather it's an authoritarian centrist ideology. It is much closer ideologically to Stalin than any commie would like to admit, because ultimately what fascism did, as in actual fascist regimes historically, their idea of the economy was corporatism and state ownership of the means of production. Not as extreme as the outright Marxist-Leninist states did, in that the fascist states still tried to maintain kind of a facade of private ownership, but still under strong state regulation and control, kind of like the CCP today, which, by the way, that's a subject for another video, how the Chinese Communist Party is actually just a neo-fascist regime. But anyway, the important takeaway here is that the things he's complaining about in terms of economics, they're not right-wing economics. And also, that is the reason why Trump's policies have not done as well as people were hoping. Because the main issue with Orange Man is that he has not actually meaningfully reduced state spending. He's pretty much just another neoconservative at this point. And so, naturally, of course, the inflation rate has yet to actually go back to what it was under his first term. It's not because he's a literal newtsie, but rather the reason this is happening is because of the Fed and the typical two-party scam, where neither of them actually do anything about the out-of-control spending. Like, Trump will float the idea of reducing the government and float the idea of removing the income tax for anybody earning under 100K, which would be nice, but then he doesn't actually do it. But that is a socialist policy. That is a failure due to socialism, not because of him being a bad mustache man. But anyways, there's one more clip I want to go over here, and it's actually the most important and the one I'd like to wrap things up on.
But MAGA supporters see the zip ties and the chains and the planes and the dead protesters, and for a moment, that relieves the anxiety that there's nothing to be done about their problems. Except that little moment where the anxiety is gone doesn't last forever. Seymour describes this like killing a spider. For an arachnophobe, no amount of killing spiders ever cures the fear. For an ethno-nationalist, no amount of violence is ever going to be enough. The more people are brutalized by ICE, the more it's apparent that it doesn't solve anything, the more the anxiety builds and the need for violence comes back. Under the Nazis, the same thing was true.
So this is very interesting because it's actually the only part of the video that Second Thought is kind of correct on. But he's correct for a reason that he probably doesn't want to be. The reason an arachnophobe doesn't become less arachnophobic after killing a spider in their home is because spiders are still able to get into their home. Likewise, simply removing illegal immigrants without really fixing what's causing a lot of uneducated third worlders to flood the country does very little. I mean, if you have really, really strong border control, you can kinda manage it that way. But that doesn't really touch on the incentives. You see, what's happened here is that Second Thought has accidentally just made an argument for freedom of association. Because immigration, by and large, isn't really that big of an issue. Some immigrants are productive and some are not. Most of them, on average, are productive. That is assuming that the policy isn't infinity welfare to infinity bemollients. And so the issue isn't immigration, but rather the issue is socialism. The DNC in particular has been enticing uneducated, unskilled, low IQ immigration via welfare scams. Oh, come here, we'll take care of you. And in the United States especially the scam is come here, have an anchor baby, and through that anchor baby, you can then funnel a generous amount of welfare. Quite a lot of welfare, actually. It's kind of ridiculous how much welfare an anchor baby is eligible for. But it technically kind of makes sense because if that baby is born into the United States, they're a US citizen and they become eligible for all of these programs. And that's a problem because that means that people don't have free association when it comes to the enrollment of these programs. You can have a welfare system and it can work within a free market. But the thing is, it actually needs to be a mutually accepted covenant. But because the social safety net in the United States does not work that way, and instead it's just kind of open to anybody who manages to get in, that is what encourages so much unskilled immigration. Because it gets immigrants coming in for the wrong reasons. The correct reasons, when immigrants come to actually work, they are generally beneficial to society. The evidence of that is pretty strong. The issue happens when they come in to be non-productive, mooch off the welfare system, and then vote for more socialism. That's when it becomes a problem. And many United States citizens see that and are aware of the grift. And so a lot of what we're seeing isn't so much ethno-nationalism as it is more just people being ticked off that they don't have freedom of association. You have people coming in who get to mooch off of the system, and you're not allowed based on the current laws to exclude them from your life, and so people don't really have much any other recourse. Which brings me to a very important point that a lot of people won't even notice when they watch this kind of video, which is how Second Thought, and really commies in general, a huge grift that they like to pull is they like to pretend to believe in open borders for the same reasons that open borders libertarians believe in open borders. But they very much do not actually believe that. In open borders libertarian, the argument is basically that statist borders are bad because the way that the state has gained the control of that land is aggressive and therefore illegitimate. So in other words, the open borders policy, it's really just more of an abolish the state policy, which communists absolutely do not believe in. They very much want to keep the state system because the basis of communism is state ownership of the means of production. That is what collective ownership of the means of production is. That is what collective ownership of the economy is. It necessitates a level of state control and command economy. You cannot get around that. And so they don't want to get rid of a state border in the same way that a left Rothbardian would want to get rid of the state border. They want to keep the state in all the jurisdiction. So why is it then that they argue for open immigration? Well, again, because they want to keep the open enrollment into their socialist policies. So it's not so much that they believe in open borders, but rather they believe in global communism and hegemonic control. Or in other words, they believe in basically building a cage around the entire planet. They will of course try to deny that, but that is where the logical conclusions of their beliefs tend to go. Because I mean, yeah, sure, pedantically you could say there's no borders if you build a cage around the entire planet, because the planet is a sphere, but that's obviously not anything to do with freedom, and is very much not respecting anybody's natural rights. And as for the rest of Second Thought's video, it's pretty much just him further fear-mongering on ICE, pretending to hold an open borders position based on principles he doesn't actually believe, and implying that ICE will one day turn on the citizens and evolve into this sort of Holocaust 2.0, and that they will start committing genocide on all the Browns any day now. I will not attempt to refute this. I will just simply calmly state that that's not going to happen, and if you don't believe me, then you can bookmark this video and watch it again once Orange Man's term is over, and you will have seen that it didn't happen. What I'm going to do instead is just wrap things up by going over the question asked at the start. The reason that communists can't stop falsely accusing everyone of being a Nazi is more than just thinly veiled justification of violent rhetoric against the targets they don't like. What's really going on here is that people who are at fault for a problem need to invent false reasons for why the problem exists. Socialists do not want to admit that the reason for the immigration crisis is largely due to socialist policies. And they also really don't want to admit to the similarities between the communist regimes of the past and the fascist regimes of the past. And so their only answer to that, in order to kind of defend their ideology, is to these intentional Mott and Bailey fallacies where they muddy the waters of what specifically fascism even is. They have to lie about it and lie about the problems that it caused and lie about why it caused those problems, because if they don't lie about it, then it becomes very obvious that what they're offering is just fascism red version. Socialist policies have completely failed to produce the economic growth that they have promised. And progressive activism has only just further cemented this identity politics and collective hatred that a lot of ethnicities have for each other these days, sadly enough. With the equity movement and woke ideology being one of the biggest failures of our time. And so the only answer the communists have to this is to just blame something else. Falsely accuse anybody who's loosely on the right of being lay bad mustache man, loosely draw associations with the problems of the day to fascist regimes of the past, equivocate between two very different definitions of what fascism even is, and presto, capitalism is one bad thing, socialism is one good thing. Communists can't possibly be responsible for any bad thing because, you know, just look at the definition. It's one good thing, not one bad thing. That is effectively what they're arguing with these false false accusations of everyone being a Nazi. It's not just projection, and it's not just a way for them to justify Antifa violence, but rather what they are doing here is a disingenuous tactic for them to avoid any kind of responsibility for when their policies fail. And on that note, I will end the video. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to support me, you can again do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by becoming a member of the channel, and doing those last two will get you priority in my QA videos. Or alternatively, you can buy some merch, of which I do have a merch store, and here's a QR code right here. But yeah, thanks again for watching. That is all. Till next time.